Good morning, everyone. I'm the Reverend Alexander Sharp. I want to welcome you this morning. I'm the director of Clergy for a New Drug Policy, which is the host of our webinar this morning, but I'm going to be mentioning other organizations as well. Before we begin in a clear way, I would be remiss to our very humanity if I did not suggest a moment of silence for the victims of the two recent shootings, most recently in Texas. I think the total is now 19 dead. So let us open our hearts and close our eyes in memory of those victims of that tragedy, those tragedies. Amen. I can't help but saying that although much of what we'll be talking about today has to do with the war on drugs, I think it's critical to realize that there is an underlying theme of violence that comes from the war on drugs. I'm not saying that these shootings were a direct result of that, but I am saying that the war on drugs divides our communities so often racially, places in tight, impoverished communities, those who have no chance or very little chance of any reasonable future. So much of that, frankly, is due to arrests or other legal offenses due to the war on drugs. So let us keep in mind through all that we hear today, the tight connection between the violence we see around us and what the war on drugs has brought to us all. By way of introductions, I'm an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. 7 years ago, almost, I started an organization called Clergy for a New Drug Policy. We have a very simple message, an elevator speech, if you will. We mobilize clergy nationally to end the war on drugs and to seek a health, not punishment response to drug use. I am thrilled to recently have been able to coax Timothy McMahan King to join. I don't think I had to coax, actually. I think he was delighted to do this. We've been friends for a long time. To join Clergy for a New Drug Policy as a senior fellow. What that means is that over the near term, we're in a transition. Tim is going to be our future, and I'm delighted to work with him in all the ways that certainly will be evident and are evident in this webinar. So my purpose, among other things, is to personally introduce him to you. Tim he's our presenter today, of course, has a remarkable blend of talents and experience. He's a nonprofit professional and owner of Vagabond Strategies, which bring social media skills to faith and social justice organizations. He's a writer. I urge you to read his book, Addiction Nation, What the Opioid Crisis Says About Us. He tells his personal story in a way that is both inspirational and profoundly insightful for all of us who want to understand the impact of drug policy and addiction in the lives of all of us. He was a community organizer in Chicago where I first met him. He was the chief strategy officer for Sojourners, the organization that has done so much, the intersection of faith and social justice, founded by Jim Wallace many years ago. He is a graduate of North Park University, has degrees in theology, philosophy, lives with his wife, Hannah, in New Hampshire. Now, also participating with us today is the Reverend Ed Treat, who will lead us through a question and answer period after Tim's presentation. He too is a founder. He started 3 years ago an organization called Center of Addiction and Faith. This is an organization that all of you should know about. Its mission is to awaken faith communities to address addiction. It attacks the stigma associated with addiction. I think all of us have an image of 12-step meetings being held in church basements. Folks in the sanctuary of churches have no connection with them, and in many ways are making those same people feel uncomfortable where they actually to come up into our congregational settings. There's a third organization I'd like to mention called the Faith and Harm Reduction. And their mission is to mobilize community at the intersection of harm reduction and faith-based organizing. I'm sure Tim will talk about harm reduction, so I'm not going to preempt anything that he has to say. It's led by, again, a colleague of both of us, the Reverend Erica Paulette, recently ordained, and leads this nationally based harm reduction. And I'd like to emphasize national. Between Clergy for a New Drug Policy, the Center of Addiction and Faith, Faith and Harm Reduction, I think it's fair to say we've got well over 5,000, and I would say that's a conservative estimate, who are involved in what we're doing nationally. And Tim, with his work in social media and digital organizing, I think is going to help us bring all these groups and others that you will bring to our attention into genuine national prominence around the issues that he will talk to us about. He has a phrase, movement ecology, which means that we don't operate in silos. We come together around specific issues, and there is so much work for us to do in ending the tragically failed war on drugs. So, and of course, it goes without saying that for all of us involved in this work, these raised, the war on drugs and drug policy raised profound moral issues, and that's really what Tim is here to crystallize and bring forward for us. So Tim, take it away.
Thanks so much, Al, and thanks to all of you who are here. It's a great pleasure to be able to present this to you today. So this is a version of a lecture I actually gave at Georgetown University. And I was asked specifically to address a group of students. It was the first master's degree program in addiction and public policy. And so it was a great group of students coming from a wide variety of backgrounds. And kind of my niche was to present on what are some of the problems and potential for Christian thought and more broadly other religious thought, kind of focusing in on Christianity as that's part of what's in the water here in the United States and in our public policy. But what's holding us back, and what are the ways that we can move forward? So today I'll be addressing drug policy in general, but also be mixing in some of this around addiction policy as well. And the lecture today isn't so much on the specifics of policy, but a broader idea of what are the fundamental moral narratives that might be holding us back. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, begin this presentation. So to start off, why faith? Why spirituality? Why religion? And especially when we're talking about public policy, because as we know, there's problems more broadly in our society today about trying to legislate specific religious beliefs. And that's not what we're talking about today. But we are dealing with the reality that when we're talking about addiction policy or drug policy, a lot of that is formed by fundamental understandings around AA, right? It is in the water. If you know anything about addiction policy, if you work in addiction policy, you can't throw a stone without hitting either an idea or a process or a person who's deeply involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that brings in a lot of that language of higher power, religion, and spirituality. And the second thing that I would say is that policy is downstream from culture. And this is important to say because this does not mean that any specific religious belief should become public policy.
Hey, Tim, sorry to interrupt
you.
We're having trouble seeing your screen. There's some black blocks in the way. I don't know if you can make that slide in the front. You see, I don't know if you can see that. Yeah.
Let me try this again.
There's still two more blocks. Oh, there you go. Well, no. Really hate to interrupt your flow.
How about now?
You got rid of the big block, but there's a long, skinny horizontal one, and then there's a square one. That one, you got your arrow on it. Yep, and that one. Good, perfect.
There you go. You got it.
All right. Well, glad you can see it now. So AA policy is downstream from culture. And what I think this means is that if we can't imagine something, or if we have a narrative that we believe about the world, it doesn't really matter what the evidence is, right? And so this happens a lot around environmental issues, for example. So if you believe that God has given the world as a resource for us to do whatever we want with it, then it makes sense that it doesn't matter the numbers around climate change, because might believe that the world is going to be consumed in fire any day now anyways, so why worry about generations down the road? And I think something similar happens with drugs, drug policy, and addiction. Specific beliefs, maybe even ones that people don't consciously hold, but it's in the water of the culture around them, limit what people think is possible. And another reality that I think we're running into within the world of addiction policy in particular, I think is well illustrated by the story of the pastor and the squirrel. So there's an old story of a pastor who every week he would do a little children's sermon and invite all the kids down to sit down around him. One week he wanted to talk about the importance of hard work in industry. So he thought he'd have the kids try to guess what animal he was describing, the squirrel. So he starts off with the kids, can anyone guess? It's a small little animal, it's gray, lives in a tree. Anyone? Big bushy tail, likes to eat acorns. Finally, one little boy raises his hand in the back and he goes, gee, pastor, sure sounds like a squirrel, but since we're in church, I know the answer is always Jesus. And that is one thing that I think we're seeing in the addiction world today, and a trend that I hope we're breaking away from, right? And this is similar to what we actually saw in cancer research. So if you look back at the history of cancer research, there was a time when cancer, we were hoping to discover the universal mechanism that caused cancer. And once the universal mechanism was discovered, we would have a universal cure, a universal therapy to address that cancer. And so we've moved early in the field, it was kind of thought more of addiction as this universal mechanism, right? Something that we could universally understand and apply to all people. And that meant we would have a universal solution. And so sometimes there have been warring camps that believe they have the universal solution. And I hope today too, that part of what opens up here is this idea that we might be headed in the same way as cancer research, to understand that people respond differently to taking different kinds of substances, and people respond differently to different kinds of approaches to address problematic substance use or harmful substance use. So with those kind of two framing pieces in mind, I want to start in the beginning. And there's a story that we all know, even if you're not coming from the Christian tradition, about the Garden of Eden. And in this story, right, we have this idea that there was a fruit, and it was at the ingestion of this fruit, at the ingestion of a physical substance, that we fell from paradise, and sin and evil and death enters the world. Now, if we have this idea that evil can reside in a substance, right? And again, this is a story that I'm not sure most people consciously apply, but if we have this in the back of our head, that evil can be enter into our bodies through a substance, then prohibition actually makes a lot of sense. So we have Billy Sunday, a big prohibitionist preacher at the turn of the last century, and he always said whiskey and beer are all right in their place, but their place is in hell. Because he and other theologians at the time behind some of the temperance movement, right? Temperance was a misnomer. There was not a temperance, a way of consuming moderately or occasionally, but the belief that addiction or sin or evil was inherent to the substance itself. So for a person to take that substance into their body was to invite evil into themselves, evil into the world. And of course, what happened? With this understanding, right, it wasn't just Adam that ate the apple in this telling of the Adam and Eve story, right? It was Eve who took the apple. Eve who then gave it to Adam. Eve who corrupted Adam in this telling. And what do we have? This is actually a drawing of my 8th great aunt, Susanna North. She was killed, burned at the stake during the Salem witch trials, right? Because there had been historically this fear specifically of women who might have knowledge of different plants or herbs that would use that then for evil and for corrupting others. And of course, if these specific substances are evil in and of themselves, then that means good people do not desire them. Good people don't want to use those substances. As our former Attorney General Jeff Sessions said, good people don't use marijuana. And we see how this plays out too in our perceptions of who is using drugs, because this also then becomes a dichotomy. This is a study that was done by Jules Netherland and Helena Hansen, looking at the differences in portrayals of the crack epidemic versus the opioid epidemic of today. And so we saw at the time, when we saw families falling apart in part with drug use, right? This was considered familial collapse. But today it is talking about almost family resiliency of children of heroin crisis find refuge in grandparents' arms. And again, we see how different drug users are portrayed, of an angelic figure versus those who are being put on the ground with their hands behind their back. So what else can we offer from Christian thought, a different kind of narrative that could shift this fundamental thinking? And I just happen to like to include this fresco found on a church from about the 12th or 13th century in Plaincourt, France. There's a very different interpretation of that story of the Garden of Eden, in which Adam and Eve are actually standing next to the psychedelic Amanita muscaria mushroom. A fun, different reinterpretation of that story, showing that we can tell these stories in a different way. It's not just what we've heard or inherited through culture. And one of the most important ways to start with that is with tov, right? This is the Hebrew word for good. And it's what we see in Genesis, that God saw everything that God had made. And indeed, it was not just good, not just tov, it was tov, very good. And in the Christian scriptures, we later see, for everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected, provided it is received with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified by God's word and prayer. The early African bishop, St. Augustine, he took on this problem because it was actually considered in the early church a heresy to believe that physical things were inherently evil. He actually said and taught that evil was no thing, right? What we call evil, what we call bad, what we call harmful is just a disordering of that which is good. And so this is a fundamental shift in how we view things. So if we're talking about fentanyl in the world today, right, there is this switch that goes in a lot of people's minds. They hear about the death that is occurring, and they begin to think of fentanyl itself as evil, as opposed to understanding that fentanyl, when it's pharmaceutical grade, when it's well dosed, when you are looking at how it might go with other drugs and other reactions, that's where you can say, oh, the problem here is not that fentanyl is evil, it's that we've created a system in which illicit fentanyl is killing people. It's that relationship that's at issue, not the thing itself. And so to set this up even more, if we have this idea that a drug is inherently evil, and in the Christian scriptures it teaches that the body is the temple, then we have a situation in which the temple is profaned. So there is early founder of the Kentucky Narcotics Hospital, one of the first addiction treatment centers in the United States. He set up a system in which he talked about the vicious versus the victim addict. And because of how drugs were viewed, right, and people who use drugs were viewed, if you became addicted, it wasn't just that you desired a bad thing, it was even worse, right? He viewed those who became addicted as psychopaths, psychoneurotic, defective personalities, right? There was something inherently wrong with the people who developed a habitual or addicted type harmful use. And the other interesting thing about this understanding of different substances is how highly culturally specific it was. Here is an etching from the 18th century in England portraying gin lane, right? Gin as being the alcohol of choice of lower income people, how it was depicted, the vice, that this was a drink of people who were vicious. Where on the other side, there's beer street, the drink of industry, the drink of creativity, the drink of people who are doing productive work. And so how we talk about the moral categories matters. And this is where I would argue that the dominant thought in the world today is that we have drug use as a taboo. And so a taboo is a very specific moral category. It's prohibition against touching, saying, or doing something for fear of immediate harm from a supernatural force. And so an example of a taboo would be to profane a temple, to bring something that is evil into a place that is holy. And so if we have the idea of a substance is inherently evil and our body is a temple, this makes drug use in that line of thought a taboo. What's unique about a taboo is that it's very closely associated with ideas of purity. And this is where we end up having harmful language, right? Once someone has achieved some kind of abstinence, they are often referred to as clean, implying that those who are not are dirty. We also have ideas of disgust. So moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt actually thinks that these ideas of taboo might come from our own evolutionary biology of a time of being afraid of things like rotting meat or polluted water from human waste. And so when we see someone break what's considered a taboo, right? Like we might cringe if we hear about a break-in, but we have disgust sometimes if we're seeing human waste on the street, or people react with disgust sometimes at those who are using drugs. The other thing about when something is placed in this moral category of taboo is it also often becomes inexcusable, right? So we have strong moral standards around killing someone, but we ask questions about how someone was killed. So if you are driving a car and you accidentally hit someone and you kill someone, that's tragic, but we react differently morally, right? We react differently from a legal perspective if that person was texting on their phone. We react differently if someone has gotten in an argument with someone else and they use their car as a weapon to run someone over. And we react differently again if we find out that this was premeditated murder, right? The killing is interpreted differently. But with a taboo, right, one of our most common taboos of today is cannibalism, right? You can't eat other people. And if you did try to give an excuse, right, you said, oh, well, the person was already dead and I was trying to reduce my carbon footprint by consuming protein that was already, right? That doesn't make it sound better. That doesn't make it sound excusable. That makes it sound even more pathological. Right? There's no good reason to do that. And with taboos, because of this idea of a supernatural force condemning or hurting or judgment or punishment, there's a fear of association, right? As if you are close to that person, you might get zapped as well. And what's problem here, right, is because it's assumed that the punishment is coming from a supernatural force, to reduce the harm associated with breaking a taboo is to stand in defiance of the will of the divine. So this is where we have a lot of people opposing a syringe exchange, people opposing a overdose prevention center, people opposing access to prescription grade opioids for those who might need it, right? There is this opposition because there is a fundamental idea that people should be punished because they are breaking a taboo. And one of the problems with a taboo is that it can be a powerful force in a society, right? Like it being taboo for men to have long hair was something that worked for decades, right? It was taboo. Most people didn't do it. But once you break it, right, once it's shown to not be true, then the entire moral system it comes from can lose its influence, can lose any kind of trust in it because it was shown to be faulty in this area. And so I actually think that there is another kind of moral category, another kind of moral system that's much more helpful in helping us understand drugs and drug use and how we should approach it. And this, you can go to Christian thought, Thomas Aquinas, but it's been about 15 years since I've read the Summa Theologica. The Nicomachean Ethics is much shorter and what Thomas Aquinas was basing his thought on in general. And so I want to go back to this idea of character. And so character for Aristotle was made up of three different things: eunoia, arete, and phronesis. So eunoia is the goodwill, right? And virtue is the good desired thing. So if for these two things, if you are generous, right, this is a virtue, and you actually want to be generous, you enjoy being generous, then that is your virtue and your goodwill, your arete and your eunoia. And phronesis would be that last part of you are generous, but are you doing it in a way with practical knowledge that shows that you are actually achieving the intended effect? So why does this matter with drug use? So let's look at this with phronesis. So phronesis is composed of two things, and it's important to understand for Aristotle, right? Character, the idea of character, was not individual. Character required a polis. Character required a good system of government. That's because you needed rational thought. You needed to know things about the thing that you were trying to do. And you needed political ability. So I think often we think about drugs and drug use, right? And that other idea, that taboo, right? That Lawrence Kolb conception is bad people who desire bad things. Now, what if we start to look at this a little bit differently, right? I know that with my own opioid use, even when it became problematic, even when it became compulsive, was rooted in a desire to address pain, to alleviate anxiety. Those are good things. And I was desiring them, and I believe in a good way. But what became a difference in what we see for a lot of people today, right, is why was I safe from a fentanyl overdose? Well, in part because I had some practical knowledge. I knew what my dosage was. I knew what the purity was. And I also had the political ability to get it in a way that allowed me not to be in danger of an overdose. So when we see these overdoses, right, when we see lives being lost, right, are we actually talking about what people are doing, or should we reframe this in a very different way? And Al had mentioned before, I love this framing of drug use. Reverend Erica Paulette, describing her own period of more chaotic drug use, she said, "My drug use was an incredibly resourceful way I crafted and employed to move myself through trauma to surviving and ultimately thriving." And so when we understand drug use, as Erica put that forward, and in putting it in this different way, moving away from the taboo, then when we talk about the overdose crisis, when we talk about what's going wrong, there is a failure of character, but we're not talking about individual character. We're talking about a failure of our politics, of political ability, of allowing for rational thought. So one other piece here, the cross. What does the cross represent, and why does it matter to drugs and drug policy? So if you believe that the cross is fundamentally about a God who requires blood, a God who requires violence in order for people to find forgiveness, in order for people to find restoration, in order for people to find resurrection, then it makes sense that we have a system designed to try to make people suffer as much as possible, that we have a system that is primarily built on the use of state violence against people. This is our system of mass incarceration. This is our system of saying that people need to suffer more. If we put in more consequences, if we increase jail time, that this is going to get us out of the problem. There's a very different way of looking at the cross. And one of those ways is from father of Black liberation theology in the United States, wrote a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. He said, until we can see the cross and the lynching tree together, there can be no genuine understanding of Christian identity in America. Now, what did he mean by that? Right? The cross was a tool of torture and public execution that the Romans used against people they were oppressing to try to keep them under their thumb, to try to keep them oppressed and afraid. And the lynching tree is the closest equivalent we have in our culture today of what the cross meant at the time of Christ. It was a tool of torture. It was a tool of death that was used to strike fear into the heart of a people who were already being oppressed. There's a story about Billie Holiday, famous jazz singer who had a difficult life, victim of sexual abuse, assault, neglect. At the age of 16, began drinking heavily. It wasn't too long until she was also beginning to use IV heroin. And even though she had tried different times to stop, she warned others not to try the drug. She didn't want it for anyone else. Even with a few periods of abstinence, she was never able to fully kick her habit. But she became the target of Harry Anslinger, a man who was in some ways the architect of the war on drugs that we have today. And she became the target of Harry Anslinger, not just because she had begun using heroin. That really wasn't what had drawn his attention. What drew his attention was when she began singing the song, Strange Fruit, a song about the lynching tree. I'm going to take a moment just to play this song for those of you who might not be familiar.
Tell me, strange fruit. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter cry.
So Billie Holiday was shut out of club after club, in large part because she had been targeted by Harry Anslinger for singing this song, for holding up this tool of torture and putting it back on the people who were trying to oppress. And as a result, her health was declining. She was brought in on probably trumped up drug charges and shackled to a hospital bed. The federal agents, against the protests of the doctors, forced them to cut her off from methadone, pushing her into withdrawal, which her body in a weakened state could not handle. And she died, a victim of Harry Anslinger's early drug war. But what she said soon before she died was, one day America is going to smarten up. It may not happen in my lifetime. Whether or not it does is no skin off mine, because I can't be hurt any more than I have been. She was somebody who found hope, who found faith, who continued in her speaking out and speaking up. And I have to imagine that even as she persisted, right, in spite of negative consequences, because of the substance use disorder she had, she also could persist in spite of the negative consequences in calling out the kind of violence that she and so many others were experiencing at the hands of the state. And so when I think of what Billie Holiday stands for, that is when I begin to think of the hope for Christian thought in drug policy, for saying that it is not the violence, right? It is not the bloodshed. This is a saying that the love has conquered death. Grace has conquered death, that there is resurrection even in the midst of things being bleak. Even when we are seeing violence all around us, there is hope for a different kind of path. And with this, I think today there's probably a lot more folks on who are coming from a faith tradition, but when I was originally presenting, this was to a mostly secular environment. And so I also wanted to point out some of the important things of that we see in addiction and recovery, and people finding new health and new life in their own way, things that matter from a spiritual and religious perspective. So a few studies that I want to pull out. The first was two researchers, Leake and King. They went to 3 different alcohol recovery centers, and they looked at everyone who is being treated there. And they put together a list for the treatment, for the folks who are running the treatment centers. And they said, these are the people we believe are most likely to enter into some sort of recovery. And sure enough, they were right. Each person on that list was more likely to get sober and stay sober. If they had a setback, it was shorter and less severe. And at the end of this research, everyone wanted to know, what was the secret? What was it that the researchers had discovered that could so accurately predict this? Well, it turns out it was nothing. They had randomly assigned each person to that list. It was the expectations of the counselors that mattered. In another study, looking at 3 different evidence-based methodologies, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational enhancement therapy, and 12-step facilitation, looking at different centers. These are folks who are all supposed to be trained by the same people, using the same methodology and helping others recover. But as you can see from these charts, significant difference. There was not one methodology that was consistently more effective. Each different site had different effectiveness rates. And when they looked at what could be causing that factor, they found that it was primarily the empathy rating of the counselors towards the people that they were working with. In another study, this was Dr. William Miller, one of the co-founders of motivational interviewing, wanted to show the effectiveness of longer therapy, but when it turned, no matter how many times he studied it, how many different ways, a basic treatment as usual that involved one empathetic intervention was not statistically better than some of these other interventions. We went through and started looking at the literature and found a study that showed that just one 10-minute intervention inside of an emergency room from an empathetically trained interventionist could significantly increase the likelihood of someone addressing problematic drinking. Also found that the tone of voice a doctor used when talking to somebody about their drug use or about their drinking could significantly predict whether or not that person sought any kind of help. And he asked the question, what might frame the substantial observed effects of these interpersonal interactions? What we do know that is A, interpersonal, B, even in relatively small doses can have a marked and sometimes profound effect. C, seems to work by decreasing negativity. And D, the more severe the problem, the larger the response. His conclusion was in what medical ethics is called beneficence. Judaism, it's called hesed. In Islam, it's called ramah. In Christianity, it's called agape. We probably just call it love. And so this is true not just in addiction treatment, right? Not just in treatment of substance use disorders. George Valiant, in his book, Spiritual Evolution, talked about the fact that for years, decades, one of the top treatments for treating schizophrenia was to induce a diabetic coma. So now to induce a diabetic coma was very dangerous. So the people who were getting this treatment, they got a lot of care from the people who were treating them. They got a lot of empathy because it was a painful and hard treatment. But with the rise of other pharmaceutical interventions, this treatment was overlooked or was looked at again. He said, we must never forget that treatment, the treatment turned out to be what he called an active placebo, right? This diabetic coma had no real effect, that it was really the fact that the people who administered it believed in it. They had hope that it would get people better, and they cared for those who were going through the process. He said the efficacy of faith, hope, and love was what we had missed in over 700 scientific papers. Now, there are limitations, of course, right? When we're talking about substance use disorders, there is always that medical side. Simply praying about it, simply talking to people in spiritual terms, does not actually help. And this was again tested. People who were interested in the spirituality of recovery wanted to see, hey, if we add in even more, does it get better? And that was what the researchers were looking for, and they did not find any evidence. They added in spiritual direction with trained practitioners, and they found that it had no decreased substance use at all. And so this gets even more interesting, and I'll leave this as kind of a question mark, something that is going to continue to be explored, but as an example of the kind of drug policy that could be held back if we have those old mindsets, but if we have a more expansive view, right? If we have an understanding that people often are using drugs for good reasons, right? They are attempting to fix something in their lives. They're attempting to connect. They're attempting to do the kinds of things we do all the time in our everyday life. If we can switch some of these mindsets away from saying that no, punishment is not the answer, then we can be open to new approaches and new ideas. And one of the big ways that this is evidenced today is around Johns Hopkins just received the first federal grant for psychedelic treatment and research in 50 years. And this came as a result of a small scale study on smoking cessation. And what they found was that with 3 doses of psilocybin or magic mushrooms, along with cognitive behavioral therapy, at 6 months, 80% of smokers treated this way had remained abstinent. And to put that in perspective, right, the best treatment studied in a similar way before this had a 35% success rate. That's more than double. Now, this is a small scale study. We're still waiting to see what more of the data is going to say. We're going to see what other kinds of areas this can be applied to, but there's already promising research around reducing stimulant use, specifically cocaine, addressing problematic drinking from a study at NYU. And there was one study that even found that any kind of lifetime psilocybin use may be associated with a decreased risk for opioid use disorder. So these numbers are coming in. But if we have an open mind, then these things will make a lot more sense than if it's part of a narrative that we can't accept. One of the most interesting things about this research that is sometimes overlooked, that brings back that science and faith together, is this finding at the bottom. The researchers wrote, "These results suggest a mediating role of mystical experience in psychedelic facilitated addiction treatment." That's right. Everybody who went through this study was administered a questionnaire about their kind of experience in specifically religious and spiritual terms. And the higher they scored on that mystical-like experience scale, the more likely that person was to remain abstinent from smoking. So I hope that we are in a place where it is no longer the answer to every question is Jesus because we are a church, or that the answer to every question is AA, or even that the answer to every question is just a Western understanding of the scientific method, that we understand the full complexities of who we are as human beings, and that can be a way that Christian thought can change culture, and that culture can allow the best public policy to move forward. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Tim. Gosh, you can make an hour seem really short. That was amazing. Thank you for the work you've done on that and the reflection and powerful stuff. There's so many questions that it raises and thoughts for discussion. I'm wondering, Al, did you have anything you wanted to? We have a couple questions in the Q&A. Maybe we can start with those.
Go right ahead. Very good.
Yep. Joy Gardner, I love the squirrel analogy because, that's just the way the church gets embedded with their thought process. It's like we've always done it that way, so they just keep doing it. It's sort of like the story with a mom and the ham at Easter. Why she cut it in half is because they'd always cut it in half. The oven was only so big, right? And then we get stuck in these ways of thinking and believing. And I love that you are stepping up to challenge some of that, because we really need to. Joy Geinerman adds this comment. She says the appeal to nature is common thinking around drugs, particularly weed. But for today, I think she's making, you can see the question, right, Tim? Do you understand what she's getting at there?
Yes. So she's talking about today's cannabis is not your dad's cannabis,
Right.
not your grandparents' cannabis, right? It's significantly more potent. So this is true, right? There's a lot of strains that are much more potent, but I also want to pull out a couple of other things. And so Joy, completely agree with you and appreciate, like, I'm all for prevention because it is true on kids' brain development. There's no study saying that it's good for kids' brain development for them to be using cannabis regularly, and some of these potent ones can have significant negative effects. Now, a couple of other things. One is cannabis use has continued to go down among most teenagers over time, and the rise of legally available cannabis did not reverse that trend. And Nora Voklaw, she has publicly admitted that she was wrong about what legalization would do. One other thing that we saw, right? So the other piece of it is what's often referred to as the iron law of prohibition. 2020 and 2021 were record drops in teen drug use, right? Most teens are getting their drugs through social circles or using out the eye of their parents. So we saw record drops. It was about 25% drop in teenage substance use. Now, over the course of between about 2010 to 2019, we averaged roughly 500 teenage overdoses per year. What happened in 2020? We were at over 900. 2021, over 1,000 teenage overdoses, while teenage drug use is going down. This is a result of the iron law of prohibition, right? We know that during alcohol prohibition, people moved from beer and wine to distilled spirits. Distilled spirits that were often either poisoned intentionally by the federal government to try to make sure that people weren't using alcohol that had been made for industrial purposes, or from people experimenting to try to create types of alcohol that might skirt around the law, or because ethanol is what gets people drunk, methanol is what makes people blind and die. We've seen the same thing with opioid use, right? Opioids have gotten dramatically more potent because there's a demand there, and we have tried to repress that demand. And instead of being successful, we just made it so that smugglers, people who are trafficking in drugs, were highly incentivized to create as potent versions as possible. And so while we have seen with the wide scale availability of some sort of legally available cannabis an increase in potency as well, right? Industry has also been pushing that trend. What we've also seen is a decrease in teenage synthetic marijuana use, which is also dangerous and oftentimes has even worse effects because most of the time you don't know what's in that synthetic marijuana. So all that to say is I do think that prevention is important, but the criminalization is not the most effective way when considering all of the other consequences of decreasing that teenage use when we have these other levers we can pull, right? We had very successful campaigns to reduce smoking among teenagers. We reversed some of those trends once the technology of nicotine vaping came up. But if we have these other ways to educate young people, if we have other means of trying to make sure that they are protected, that I think is what we need. Those are the levers we need to focus on, because we know that criminalization can cause violence. And oftentimes what we're seeing is, to try to protect teenagers in the suburbs, right? We end up having places where it's war-torn, it's, neighborhoods that are getting torn up by the drug war. And so that's where I think we can do education, intervention, prevention, and create a system in which we aren't continuing to just incentivize new designer research chemicals that teens can get online. That's where there are still opioids right now. They're as potent as fentanyl, that if you know what chemical website to go onto, you can just order. We aren't going back from that reality. The internet's here. People are going to be able to do that to make sure that we have a drug supply that can dry up the illicit market is going to be important, and we can put restrictions on that.
Well, can't we just tell the kids that they shouldn't use it? I mean, wouldn't that do the trick? Well, I have this idea that what the Center of Addiction and Faith can access is churches, and churches can access youth and families, and I think that's where we can really do some great preventative work. And I think if we could have our young people, and I had 4 kids go through high school, they knew who the people were that were using inappropriately, and they would talk about them and in a way glorify them. They were, they thought that was funny and cool. But if they were educated about what this really means, and they were able to recognize that these kids have a serious life-threatening problem and it could possibly kill them, we could turn our kids into, interventionists and help them to know how to respond to those other kids. We could do some great work. But I think, the question that Joy brings and the answer that you give is what you started out with in this talk, was that it's like with cancer treatment, it's complex, and we have to have several different approaches to the problem. And no one way is, exactly right. But if we have a lot of levers we can pull, we can actually start to make some difference. Yeah.
And I think Joy has followed up to say, yeah, people can equate legal with safe. And we know right now that one of the big killer every year is roughly 400,000 still die from tobacco related causes. That I think has been a huge issue, but we have successfully reduced population-wide smoking dramatically. And that kind of education can happen. And that's where in Canada, they are experimenting with various safer supply models where people can have access to pharmaceutical grade drugs that they might be addicted to. And they put big labels on there, right? It's highly restricted access. It's not being sold at corner stores. It's not being put alongside beer or wine at a convenience store, which is a whole other issue that we treat such a toxic drug so lightly in that way too. I'm all for us talking a lot more about the dangers of alcohol too. There are ways that we can do it that are coupled with education that can talk to people about the potential consequences while making sure that we don't have 107,000 die from overdoses every year.
Well, and again, about the prevention piece is that the only place families and anyone really learns about addiction is after having fallen into the river. We get pulled out and then we get an education and we go, oh, that explains why I fell in the river. It would have been nice to have that information before I fell in the river, because I might not have gone down the river so far or not gone in at all. And that information does empower people not to go so far into their addiction. So somehow we have to have some enlightenment further earlier in life and not wait until people are really in trouble. We're down to about 3 minutes, and I know that there's going to be some lively conversation around this, and I want to make sure everybody can get in, because we've had issues before with people not getting the link in time or not being able to get into the Zoom discussion following. I've had a couple people say that they couldn't copy the link from the site. So I'm going to put the link up here again to make sure you can all get in there. And then I will invite you to email me. I'll put my email in here. If you can't copy and paste it from the chat, then email me at pastor@addictionandfaith.com, and I will send you the link directly to make sure you can get in there. So Dr. Mondiak Sizer is listening in. He's head of Health and Human Services down in Louisiana. He is going to be one of our guest keynote speakers at the conference coming up in October. He's brilliant, but he's here today and he's got a couple questions, and I don't know that we're going to be able to get to them with the 2 minutes left. So I'm hoping people will jump over.
I read the questions, and I think they read like a good webinar description that we should have Dr. Sizer kind of explain, because I think he's going to be more qualified to lay out for us. But I do, just to give a quick highlight, talking about ingesting of sin as a perpetuation and concepts of identity, place, responsibility, and systems, the trauma-related behaviors exhibited by Adam and Eve. I have gone through, as a personal practice, sometimes gone through and in reading scripture, replaced every reference of sin with trauma. And as an exercise to see how that changes, right? To think of, in trauma, did my mother conceive me? And so I think we'll need to have Dr. Sizer on soon to lay it all out for us.
Those questions he posed are exactly what I want him to speak about at the conference. And then I'm hoping you can unpack some more about the psychedelics, because what exactly, do they know exactly why those are effective? What is it about that experience that actually helps people?
So they are still kind of lots of debates about the mechanism of action. And there's a couple of primary theories. The first is that it gets parts of the brain talking to each other that normally don't. And so if we think of addictive behaviors as very tight neural loops that people can't easily or can't break on their own, it temporarily suspends those neural loops to allow parts of the brain to connect that reorients that particular behavior. And also in that study too, the researchers really emphasized that it was not psilocybin on its own, it was psilocybin plus cognitive behavioral therapy. And the idea there is that you have kind of almost a privileged moment in someone's life where they are much more open to change and receiving different kinds of information. And so that temporary suspension of those normal neural loops, it's also the suspension of what they call the default mode network, then increases neuroplasticity, which again, there's a lot of scientific debate about exactly how that works, so that the cognitive behavioral therapy becomes significantly more effective in that time, that those lessons from CBT are really able to sink in. And very interesting that Bill Wilson was quite the proponent of the use of LSD in the 1950s before it was scheduled, and integrating it into addiction treatment. And that white light moment that he had, where he envisioned, people across the world helping each other, and he felt this overwhelming sense of unity. He was actually on a treatment at that time that included the consumption of belladonna and henbane, two psychedelic plants that aren't commonly used because they also are fairly toxic. But he was on that belladonna cure at the time of having that experience. So if you question the validity of it, right, like it does seem reasonable to say Bill Wilson, his initial experience had a biochemical reality to it.
Well, I just want to make sure that we have the spoiler here that for those addicts that are hearing this and get excited that they can take some psychedelics, it does need to be done under the direct supervision of a professional, right? Is that correct to say?
Well, if you have found, stability in abstinence, I don't encourage anyone to change that course. Really, the place where it's being researched and we know the most about it is in clinical settings for people who are trying to step out of active use.
Great. So thank you, Tim. You're, as always, amazing. I never get tired of listening to you. You're going to be, hopefully, we haven't even talked about this, but I'm going to put you on the spot here. I'd like you to do a workshop on psychedelics at our next conference, if that would be something you'd be willing to do. So you're committed to it now. You can't back out. I have witnesses, all kinds of them. Anyway, jump over to the conversation. We have some questions we didn't get to that are really good. We had some suggestions in the chat that are really good, like a movie about mushrooms, Fantastic Fungi on Netflix. I haven't seen that, but it sounds interesting. And then Bob Babcock posted trauma that happens during proverbial infancy may be dealt with via psychedelics, perhaps. Anyway, I think it sounds like what it does is breaks down some walls of resistance in terms of our psyches. Thank you, Reverend Al Sharp, for your work. And I think we should further discuss the bringing together of some organizations that are doing some work together, as Tim suggested. Any last words before we sign off? You're muted, Al. Al.
You asked me to mute, I muted. No, can't hear me. I just want to end with where we began there. This isn't simply one organization or two organizations or three. We think we are bringing together a faith-based group that is genuinely national in scope, and we're finally going to put an end to the war on drugs as we know it. And we didn't get into a lot of the policy issues in the war on drugs, but Tim has given us the undergirding of faith and motivation and inspiration that will guide all of our work together. So thank you all.